Well, staying with the story now, the Israeli military has issued a call on Palestinians in Rafah in southern Gaza to evacuate immediately, with reports of bombing and airstrikes in eastern Rafah indicating a long-promised assault on the region. The announcement will likely further complicate diplomatic efforts to agree on a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. For more, let's now bring in our U.S. correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease, who is reporting that Gazans have already begun evacuating the area. Sherwin, good afternoon to you, and thank you so much for your time. So we're already getting reports of explosions in eastern Rafah, likely the beginning of this long-awaited assault in the south of Gaza then. What has been just some of the early reactions to these latest developments, particularly from the UN and the United States?
What's the broad context here, Unati? Remember, Rafah is the last protective area where many Gazans in the north and central parts of the Gaza enclave fled to at the beginning of this war almost 7 months ago. So a city essentially that housed around 275,000 people at the beginning of this almost 7-month conflict is now sheltering around 1.3 million people. And that just talks to the breadth of the situation we are facing here. What has been the initial reaction? We have heard even before this escalation from the Israelis, from the likes of the European Union that were completely against the Rafah invasion. The White House has been very clear. Antony Blinken, who was in the region last week, saying very clearly that the U.S. won't be able to support a military operation in Rafah, claiming the damage it would cause would be beyond what is acceptable. Joseph Borrell, the EU High Commissioner for the High Representative for Foreign Affairs, says Israel's evacuation orders to civilians in Rafah portend the worst. More war and more famine. It is unacceptable, he says. Israel must renounce a ground offensive and implement the UN Security Council resolution that was passed, calling for a ceasefire during the month of Ramadan, but then also leading to a more sustainable ceasefire. The Secretary General Antonio Guterres, speaking last week, said a military assault on Rafah would be an unbearable escalation, killing thousands more civilians and forcing hundreds of thousands to flee. It would have devastating impact on Palestinians in Gaza, with serious implications for the occupied West Bank. This is some more about what from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres speaking to the media in New York last week. Let's watch.
For the sake of the people of Gaza, for the sake of the hostages and their families in Israel, and for the sake of the region and the wider world, I strongly encourage the government of Israel and the Hamas leadership to reach now an agreement. Without that, I fear the war, with all its consequences both in Gaza and across the region, will worsen exponentially. More than 1.2 million people are now seeking shelter in Rafah Governorate, most of them fleeing the Israeli bombardment that has reportedly killed over 34,000 people. They have very little to eat, hardly any access to medical care, little shelter, and nowhere safe to go. In northern Gaza, the most vulnerable, from sick children to people with disabilities, are already dying of hunger and disease. We must do everything possible to avert an entirely preventable human-made famine.
So a crisis on top of a crisis now that the Israelis have made clear, despite international pressure against this move, that they will now start a military offensive in eastern Gaza, essentially asking 100,000 Palestinians living right now in tent cities amid wet, rainy conditions, who are now packing up the little that they've taken with them to the south and trying to escape what is likely now to be an intensive military operation from Israel. A little bit more context for you, Nati. We do understand that this latest escalation comes after Hamas rockets fired from Rafah, the area that Israel is now targeting. They fired these rockets. It hit a military staging area at the Karim Shalom border crossing in the south of the border between Israel and Gaza, killing at least 3 Israeli soldiers and injuring several more. So we understand that it adds a little bit of context here as to why we are now seeing this escalation from the Israelis, particularly in the broader context of these intensive ceasefire negotiations that were happening in Egypt, in Cairo, just over this last weekend.
Of course, just to give some sense of context for our viewers there, these are live visuals that they are seeing, in light of those fresh bombardments that we are hearing currently happening now in Gaza. And like you say, Sherwin, I mean, this is like a crisis on top of another crisis. So what are the implications then here, particularly for the long-awaited ceasefire between Hamas and Israel?
So much anticipation going into this weekend, so much so that I thought we might today be talking about, the parameters of a ceasefire deal that has now finally been agreed between the two sides. This was the level of optimism you were hearing from Israeli officials. Anthony Blinken was saying, it's now really up to Hamas to accept this. But what we understand to be the main sticking point here was that the Hamas authorities are saying, we want this ceasefire for hostage deal to end the war. Israel has made clear that that is not a non-starter until, as the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, has achieved what he calls total victory against Hamas. And we can discuss what total victory means, of course, different permutations to what that might look like and what that might mean. But obviously there are divisions we are seeing even between Israel and its closest allies in terms of this Rafah operation. We understand that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will have a conversation within hours with the US President Joe Biden. Joe Biden is also later today meeting with King Abdullah II of Jordan, which is a key strategic partner in that region, to see what pressure diplomatically can now be placed on the parties so that this ceasefire deal, whether it's a temporary ceasefire, as the initial iteration goes, they wanted for 6 weeks to get some of these hostages released. That's what the Israelis, I think, are agreeing to. Hamas is saying, we will not agree to give you the leverage that we do have now, which is the retention and the continued hostage taking of so many Israeli civilians. They will not release these hostages if Israel does not agree that, were they to do that, this war would then be brought to an end. The Israelis are saying, this is just a temporary pause that we'll agree to for the hostages to be returned, but that they will continue their military operations until the so-called total victory is achieved. And that is the big dispute. That is the big chasm we see today, even between allies, Israeli allies, the United States, who do not want to see Israel move militarily into Rafah, which now appears to be the case.
Sherwin, thank you so much for that. Of course, Sherwin Bryce-Pease is our correspondent coming to us live there from New York. Of course, this new bombardment in the area is happening in eastern Rafah. Those visuals there coming to you live. Hamas has also warned that Israeli military offense on Rafah in southern Gaza will not be a picnic. And of course, Hamas saying there it is fully prepared to defend Palestinians. Of course, those are the visuals that we are bringing you there, and we are hearing now that thousands of people are fleeing eastern Rafah to go to nearby areas. Of course, we've been told that there is hardly any place in Gaza that is safe at this point in time. So one wonders then to what extent this latest bombardment will infringe on the Gazans.